Good evening. This is London SWF 365. I'm Chris Jones, and it's Saturday. It's 6 o'clock, and it's Houston Howard Hour. Houston, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it, guys. Super happy to be here. I spoke at this festival last year. It was a lot of fun, and I've had the chance to connect with quite a few of you since then. So I was really stoked when they invited me back. I guess I didn't screw it up too bad, but you know, it's been an interesting time for me. One, you know, I have an 8-day-old, so that's cool. Also, I'm in Texas, and I don't know if anybody is keeping it with what's going on in the States, but Texas has been completely disaster zone with snow, and so I've been without power and water for days, but I've finally got it all back on just in time to hang in with you guys. So I'm sleep deprived, unshowered, but super excited to talk about some things that can bring you value today. I wanted to sort of hit some different notes than I did in my last session that I did here at the London Screenwriter Festival. I talked about Super Story last time, that and specifically sort of, you know, how to leverage a multi-platform model in today's world and the necessity of that. I want to do a little bit of that today, just in case some of y'all weren't here last time. But I want to kind of go into some new areas of content that I think that can bring you value, which is that of a story world. How do we create a story world? How do we do a little bit of world building that can really fuel and be the engine for a super story as you develop with a multi-platform mindset? Even if you're writing, you know, small character drama scripts, story world can be important, as we'll be discussing today. So I'm excited to dig in with you guys. So if you're unfamiliar with who I am, my name is Houston Howard. Houston's my first name, not my last name. People get messed up. Houston, like Whitney or the city. But I am a transmedia professional. I focus on multi-platform storytelling. I'm actually a lawyer, trained as a lawyer several years ago, decided not to practice law, get on the other side of the transaction. I was practicing entertainment law, shift to the other side of the transaction, get into writing and producing, started writing and producing for film and television. And but I had a diverse creative background even before then. I've developed board games, I've written for the stage, I've, you know, dabbled in music and some songwriting and things like that, a lot of poetry, things like that. And so early into my sort of quote unquote Hollywood career, I was able to diversify my my vision of what my profession should be and what my career should be, and really was looking at how to develop content with a multi-platform mindset, because I just didn't want it to be one thing. I grew up a child of the 80s and 90s, you know, and on you know, the sort of the height of those early franchises, the you know, G.I. Joe, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you know, Star Wars, big Star Wars fan, you know, it's just big IP that I love watching Saturday morning cartoons, and then being able to read the comic books, and then be able to play the game all throughout the week. And it just kept me engaged as a fan. And so I've always sort of leaned into that just personally. And so I like stuff like that. You know, I'm a big Star Wars fan, big Marvel fan. Love what they're doing with the MCU. I like big IP. I like small IP too. Don't get me wrong. I love the small character drama as much as anybody else. But ultimately, when it got into what I wanted to create, I wanted to create the things that I was a fan of, but it was incredibly difficult. So it set me on a path of trying to figure out, like a creative puzzle, how to develop things that work on multiple platforms. And I ended up publishing a book called Make Your Story Really Stinking Big. And then was published through Michael Weesey. Was one of the first books on the market that talked about how, as a creator, how you can shepherd an idea into a multi-platform plan, into a multi-platform world. That did really well. As soon as I published the book, I was able to then Mattel called me, and I got in with them and worked on a project called Monster High, which is a $500 million year brand for Mattel. Worked on their multi-platform plan, did multiple projects with them, worked with the Disney Imagineers, worked with Fox, Sony, CBS, ABC, worked in film, worked in television, worked on streaming stuff. I've worked with dozens and dozens of novelists. I've worked in the video game space with Electronic Arts with their Plants vs. Zombies IP. Worked with Atlantic Records in the music industry, but so I have a very diverse creative perspective here. I've done a lot of stuff in China. I've sold a couple projects, a couple scripts into China, Transmedia projects into China with Alibaba and Boda Film Group. So I hit all this from a different angle than just the pure screenwriter, which I think is refreshing. I think that's good because you guys maybe are the pure screenwriter, and it's good to hear somebody out of your circle kind of put pressure on some ideas. And so I, a couple of years ago, published my second book called "You're Going to Need a Bigger Story." That's done really well, and it's been cool. And getting ready to release a workbook component that goes along with that just within the next month, and really prepping my third book called Launch, which is going to be later this year. So I'm sort of in this world of multi-platform development, and but it really kind of is anchored by film and television. And I really, if you were to make me pick, I look at myself as a screenwriter first, as a writer first, but with an eye toward these other things. And so today I want to talk about tentpole vision and indie execution, and what we need to be able to do that. And so what the reason I chose this title is simply because what people think when they think multi-platform is we talk about Star Wars, we talk about Marvel, we talk about some of the bigger stuff, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, things like that, and you think tentpole, and you say, well, I don't want to do sword and sandal fantasy, I don't want to do tentpoles, I don't want to do epic sci-fi, I don't want to do superheroes or zombies, and I get how all this model works for those types of stories, but I want to do the small romantic comedy. And one thing that I would encourage you guys to understand and think of is examination of tentpoles is very valuable, whether you want to do a tentpole or not. That is sort of, that honestly is meaningless whether you want to actually do it or not. You should always examine things that lead the market, and understand the things that lead the market, because those are the things that are training audiences, and those audiences are the same audiences that's going to watch your stuff and read your stuff. And it's good to understand the principles they're into, and if you can extract the principles that the tentpoles are using and being able to apply those tentpoles to a shoestring budget film or an indie script or whatever, I think that's where some magic can exist. I always liken it to, if you look up in the sky and you see a Boeing 777 flying through the sky, that plane is using the law of lift to supersede the law of gravity, and that's how the thing is flying. And you may say, well, I don't have $1 billion to have the law of lift supersede the law of gravity, and so you don't even try. But the fact of the matter is, if you fold up a little piece of paper in a very specific way and you throw it across the room, guess what? That little paper airplane uses the law of lift to supersede the law of gravity. And so it's using the same principles as the big guy, even though, we obviously have a scaled down budget. There's definitely differences in how far it will go, things like that. But it's using the same principles. And I think that is an interesting sweet spot that we can examine. If you say, okay, cool, like I get it. How do I tell some different stories, and how do I connect these, right? Whether it's just a podcast and a short story on Wattpad and a script. How do I do that? Like, what's the creative asset that you need? And when you try to do it, sometimes it's harder than you think. And typically that has to do with the lack of a good story world, right? And so what I call a story world is just the narrative universe where your stories exist. And this is vitally important to a super story model. And so the common denominator of all these multi-platform projects, whether it's Star Wars, The Walking Dead, League of Legends in video games, something like Batman or The Matrix, is that they all have great story worlds, right? So the things that are again training audiences and leading the market all have these really super interesting story worlds, right? But in order to understand this, we have to understand the difference between story and story world. They're very different things, and so we have to shape our mindset, right? So we understand the story of the Lord of the Rings. You know, Frodo takes the ring, throws it in the volcano, saves the world, right? That's the story of the Lord of the Rings. But the story world is Middle Earth, right? So when we're talking about story world, we're literally just talking about the geography of where the stories take place, right? And where do all the stories come from? And it's very different than, you know, this is bigger than Frodo, bigger than Bilbo, bigger even just than the One Ring. You know, something like Detective Pikachu. We know the story of Detective Pikachu, but what's the story world? Rhyme City, right? It's a city where Pikachu and Pokemon and humans can sort of coexist together, right? The story, we know the story of Game of Thrones, Starks versus Lannisters, et cetera, right? Story world is Westeros, right? Westeros and Essos. Stranger Things, we know the story, right? But that story world is Hawkins, Indiana. So you don't need sword and sandal fantasy. You don't need epic sci-fi to be able to have a good story world, right? I mean, I think Hawkins is interesting. Even by itself, it's bigger than just 11 and bigger than just Mike and the gang, right? The Wire, a classic HBO series of The Wire, right? We know the story of The Wire, but the story world is Baltimore, right? It's just a broader world than just this one story. And that TV show is just one story that takes place in that world. One of my favorite shows, Ozark. You know, the this crime drama of this particular family is the story. The story world are the Ozarks, right? Now, I don't know if anybody's ever been to the States, been to the Ozarks. Just a weird place, right? And it's interesting. It's an interesting place in and of itself. And so, great story worlds don't have to be genre specific. You know, in this regard, right? Some of my favorite story worlds aren't sword and sandal fantasy or sci-fi or superheroes or zombies. Bridgerton, I think that debutante England is just a really super interesting story world to explore. Deadwood, again, HBO series of that gold mining, silver mining town of Deadwood, South Dakota. I think it was super interesting and super cool, even beyond the story of Seth Bullock. Sharp Objects, I guess I'm just repping HBO at this point. The Amy Adams, Amy Adams, I think it was Amy Adams, right? That starred in there, and that's Wind Gap, Missouri. Wind Gap, Missouri. So this really interesting, weird, small town that where the kids don't ride bikes, they roller skate and they roller skate around town, and everybody has a secret, right? Interesting place, right? Independent of any one particular story. And so again, not genre specific. Here's my rule of thumb. If you want to ask yourself whether you have a good story world or not, this is one thing that you want to ask is, can you remove your main character and still have something cool, right? Can you remove your main character and still have something cool? So again, easy example here is Batman, right? So we know the story of Batman, right? Story world of Batman is what? Gotham City. Now, here's the trick. Is it possible to remove Batman from Gotham City and still have something cool left over? Yes, of course you can, right? They have a whole TV show called Gotham that doesn't have Batman in them, right? So can you remove Frodo from Middle Earth and still have something cool? Yes. Can you remove Luke Skywalker from Star Wars and still have something cool? Absolutely. Can you remove Sherlock Holmes from Sherlock Holmes and still have something interesting? It's harder. Can you remove Rocky from Rocky and still have something interesting? Oh, I don't know. Like maybe, right? But it's so you start to see the difference between IP that's built around individual character and IP that's built around a world, right? And again, it's not world or character, it's great world with great characters, right? But if you can take your main character out and you lose everything interesting about the piece and there's nothing interesting left over, that means your IP is vulnerable around that one character, and that everything is centered. And what you're going to find is that you're not going to have an engine that allows you to produce more stories, across platform over time, right? You have to have that good story world in place. You have to be able to describe it. One thing I like to do is I like to do a story world log line where I don't mention any characters at all. right? If you could, we understand log lines for stories and scripts, right? But try to do a log line just for your story world without mentioning your character or your story or your plot, right? And if you can make that sound awesome and interesting, you probably have a pretty good world, right? So something like The Purge, right? The Purge. A story world log line for The Purge may be, The Purge is a dystopian America where all crime is legal for a day. That, I didn't mention any characters. I didn't mention a plot. I didn't mention anything that happens in any of the movies. I just described the world in the way that makes the world seem awesome, right? And so, again, Bridgerton. Bridgerton is a world of debutante England where once a year there's the season that all these families try to marry off their kids, right? That doesn't talk about any of the individual characters. That just makes that world seem interesting, right? So can you describe the world in a way that is independently interesting? That's going to show you whether you have a good story world or not, right? So here's the thing I want you to take away from this is that if you don't have a story world, you don't have story potential, right? Beyond maybe your one story that you're writing. So if you don't have a story world, you're not going to have story potential. So no story world, no story potential. But look at this. If you know your story world, you will know your story potential. So it's really, really, see what I did there is to play on words. Super clever. If you know your story world, you're automatically going to know your story potential, and you're going to know how you can then grow and scale the brand over time into multiple platforms, right? So it's really, really important for you to be able to identify this. So look at something like the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, we know the story of the Hunger Games. Katniss, she volunteers for the Hunger Games as tribute to save her sister Prim, and she goes and kills a bunch of kids, overthrows the government. That's the Hunger Games, right? But the story world is Pan-Am, right? Bigger than Katniss, and it's a dystopian America where everything's been reorganized into districts. Now, what's interesting about this, guys, is if you look at where Katniss is from. Katniss is from District 12, and District 12 is right over there, West Virginia, Kentucky, actually where I grew up and I'm from. And if you watch the movie, she goes from District 12. She takes a train straight into that capital, that sea there, right over there in like Colorado. And so, and that's basically all that she explores in that world. That's it, right? She has a cup of coffee, I think, in District 13 for 5 minutes, but then she's back to the Capitol. But pretty much that's all you explore. Now, if your only conception of that story world is through the eyes of Katniss, through that trilogy, then you think, wow, I've really explored quite a bit. You actually haven't explored very much at all, right? Look at how much other story potential is there. Every district has stories. They may not all be movies, right? But they may be a podcast, maybe short stories, maybe a self-published novel, maybe a concept album with music, maybe an indie video game, a mobile game, an app, an interactive website, something, that you could produce about District 8 or District 9 or up there in the Yukon. LA's not even on the map anymore. What's left over there, right? One thing that I think is super interesting is if you look at District 4 and District 11, they both extend down into Mexico beyond Texas, right? So if I had the rights to the Hunger Games franchise right now, the first thing that I would do as soon as I hung up with you guys, I would call Univision up, which is a Spanish language broadcaster. I would pitch a Spanish language Hunger Games TV show, not about Katniss, because that story's already told. I would pitch a Hunger Games TV show about District 4 and District 11 and maybe a conflict that they have on the border between their two districts and what's going down there in Mexico while Katniss is doing her deal up north, right? I would make it Spanish language, targeted to that Hispanic demographic, right? If it's a valuable piece of the puzzle, guess what? That American audience is still going to migrate down to watch that show, even if it's subtitled, right? Because they want that piece of the puzzle. But it also creates an entry point for the international audience to now flow right into that Hunger Games IP. Here's the punchline, though. I would have never even known that was a possibility had I not actually understood what the story world was, because the story world is not Katniss's adventure, right? I really need to understand the geography, and I need to understand sort of how this thing works together in order to get that, to understand that potential. So I'm going to skip some of these. The revenue potential of your brand, I'm telling you y'all, the revenue potential of your brand completely depends on your story world. It just really, really depends on the story world. And why do we care about revenue potential of the brand? Here's why. It's what I call the story world butterfly effect. Story worlds create story potential, which is awesome, right? Just the ability, it's an engine that creates more stories for you. Why do we care about story potential? Story potential creates revenue potential. Why? Why is there more revenue potential? There's more revenue potential because there's more story potential, right? That you can create more product, right? So now instead of one movie, we have 3 movies. Instead of just three movies, we have 3 movies and 2 books, and 3 mobile games or whatever, and a podcast to boot, right? Those additional products create more revenue potential for this particular brand. Why do we care about revenue potential? 1, you should care about revenue potential because you shouldn't be a starving artist. Right. And then 2, you should care about revenue potential, even if you don't produce all that other content yourself. Just having that revenue potential baked into the cake of your script, guess what? Revenue potential attracts buyers, because buyers, which executives, people that acquire the studios, the financiers, whoever they are, these buyers are looking at revenue potential, and it just makes sense. It's like buying in bulk, and they see revenue potential attached to certain stories, and the more revenue potential attached to your story, the more attractive they're going to be to it. Of course, it can't be a crap script. Of course, it needs to be great. We have to have great characters, great plot. But if presuming you have that, if you can then build revenue potential through story potential, through a great story world around that, now you've set yourself apart from the other scripts that don't have that, right? And then why do we care about buyers? Because happy buyers means happy creators, right? We're selling stuff, and we're making deals. We're actually now in the game, and that's what that's what matters. And so that's how we're not starving artists, right? So all this stuff kind of flows together in one big meaningful way. So investing in the story worlds is like investing in bulk. So just think about this. I had a Sony executive explain this to me like this. He said, Houston, if you bring me a script that's a really good one-off script, and then somebody else brings me a really good one-off script that is a good script, it's going to be a good movie, but it has a really interesting story world that I know we could probably exploit over three different platforms over the next 10 years, right? If I can exploit it over 3 different platforms, get 10 extra stories out of that script over the next 10 years, guess what? Guess which one I'm going to put a priority on? The other one. Why? Because if you can get 10 extra stories plus the one story, then all of a sudden you now have 11 stories for the price of one. It's like going to Costco and buying in bulk, right? It's the exact same thing. And so if you watch the script sales in the market right now, COVID sort of disrupted, but especially before COVID, pre-COVID, watch what is being gobbled up. Watch what the things that are being put in development. Watch the things that Netflix and Amazon and Disney are going after. And there are these things that have these really interesting story worlds attached, because the focus in the market now is how do we one, make a good movie, of course, right? But once we make that good movie, how does this IP then flow into the rest of the ecosystem of our business, so we can exploit this IP over time in as many ways possible, right? Which is good for the creator, good for the company, and great for the fans, because now fans get more story, right? And so this is why this is why studios are very attractive to things that have story worlds, because it creates that story potential that is attached to the brand. So I want the last few minutes, and then I want to open it up to Q&A. So get ready for some Q&A in just about 6 minutes or so, because I want you to hit me with a zillion questions with this stuff. A couple things that I wanted to throw at you guys when designing a story world, right? Think about, the first step is just think about the map. Honestly, just think about the map. And I know this is geography, and you guys are writers, and I'm a writer, and I get it. Like, geography is sort of a different part of the brain. But understanding the map when it comes to your script and your story, super, super important, right? So I remember reading Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, and I loved being able to go to the front of the book and look at the map, right? It creates an extra level of engagement with the fans when you have a map, right? But even if you never show them the map, it just helps you as a writer to understand the geography of your world and where everything is, and it helps to limit continuity errors, right? When you're, especially when you're exporting across platform, because you're keeping everything in the same place. Even something like Snowpiercer has a map, right? This is just the map of the train, and you see where different things are located on the train, and it helps make it feel real. Now it takes it out of sort of this this broad idea in your head, and now you understand that this is where the prison section is. There's the water supply. There's the greenhouse. It's super important as a writer to understand where the water supply on the train is, right? Because that then helps plot. Even if you're just working on one story, it helps develop that plot of that one story, because that's now an important car in this other train. Right? If you're working on a real world story world like Daredevil is set in Hell's Kitchen, New York. Super easy to be able to do that map. You just Google map it, and then you just screenshot it and draw a box around it. So this is Hell's Kitchen, New York. And so again, it's helpful to understand where Matt Murdock's law office is, and where Jessica Jones's private investigation office is, and where the villain is from, and what happened over at the convention center, and how far away is the convention center from Hell's Kitchen Park. And it just helps sort of form out the idea of the story world beyond just that individual story, right? Then once you sort of get a map of the specific primary location, right? What I would encourage you guys to do is then think about, how can you make it bigger? How can you sort of broaden this IP out in an interesting way, right? Because if you think about Harry Potter, the idea of Harry Potter was centered around a school that taught children how to be magicians, right? And that's awesome. And so that's Hogwarts, right? But even beyond Hogwarts, J.K. Rowling then started thinking, okay, what is beyond Hogwarts? So how do I do Diagon Alley? And where does Hagrid live? And she started to put all this other stuff outside of Hogwarts, right? Which then helped flesh out that story. But guess what? Guess what the addition was? Beyond this, now this is actually the map of the story world. This is the map of the wizarding world, right? Where Hogwarts is just one particular school on this broader map. Now, because now it's gone from just Hogwarts, a school that teaches kids how to be wizards, and it's gotten it into it's an alternate dimension of Earth where wizards exist and wizard schools exist. And there's a school in New York, and there's a school in Africa, and there's a school in South America, and there's a school in Asia, and a school in the UK. And all of these have story potential attached to it, which increases the story potential of the entire brand, that increases the revenue potential of the entire brand, which makes it more attractive to buyers, right? Of course it's there. You say, well, she didn't come up with all that stuff until late in the game. Not actually, she came up with it earlier than you thought. You go back and read the books. When she started to introduce the Tri-Wizard Tournament, right, in the books, the Tri-Wizard Tournament were what? From kids from other schools that were now competing in the Quidditch match. And she already started to seed this idea of there's other schools beyond Hogwarts, right? Doesn't mean that you have to exploit it right then. You just plant the seeds for a growth plan moving forward. And obviously it worked out for her, right? Game of Thrones, the idea of Game of Thrones is centered on the seven kingdoms, right? But guess what George R. R. Martin did? He went and added Essos, right? Which is outside of the idea of the seven kingdoms, but by adding Essos and the Dothraki Sea and Karth and Valyria and Pentos and all these other places, right? What that does is it increases story potential, because now there's story potential added to all of these things beyond just the seven kingdoms. So think about that. Think about the map. How do you make your map bigger? And here's the last little tip I want to give you when you think about story worlds is I want you to think about groups, not individual characters. Groups, not individual characters. So you think about something like Iron Man, right? Iron Man, if you're thinking, how many good Iron Man stories can I tell across platform? I don't know, let's be super generous to Iron Man because we love him 3000. And let's say we can tell 100 good stories about Iron Man across platform. And that's what we got, right? Maybe it's less, maybe it's more, I don't know. But across comic books and video games and movies and TV, 100 good Iron Man stories, right? That's awesome. But if we take one superhero and make that one superhero a bunch of superheroes, a group of superheroes, guess what we've done? We've increased story potential, because I can still tell that the 100 stories of Iron Man still, but now I can tell 100 stories about Captain America, and 100 good Thor stories, and 100 good Black Widow stories, and 100 good Hulk stories, and the one good Hawkeye story, and a Nick Fury story. Like, I've increased story potential that increased revenue potential, which makes the brand more attractive, right? And especially if you watch what's going on with superheroes, superhero IP is built around groups, right? I talked about Luke Skywalker could have been the only Jedi in the galaxy. Guess what? He's not the only Jedi in the galaxy. We go one Jedi to a group of Jedi, right? Good Jedi, bad Jedi, increases story potential. Go back to Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is just an individual. But now in the modern media environment, right, what did Netflix do? They went from one Sherlock Holmes, one Holmes, to a whole family of Holmes, right? So now we have Sherlock, we have his brother, we have Enola Holmes, right? And so this increases story potential. We have Mom, right? So what they've done is they've quadrupled the story potential of the brand just by adding 3 extra characters, right? It's a real super easy calculation that we can make when you're thinking in groups. So instead of just thinking of like the John Wick, the assassin, don't just think about one assassin, think about lots of assassins. Think, and what does a world of assassins look like? And where do they live? And where do they stay? Ooh, that would be cool if there was a hotel where they all stayed. And that's the Continental Hotel, which creates story potential for you. If you say, if your story is about one cancer patient, then you say, okay, well, one cancer patient and into lots of cancer patients, right? Or maybe lots of different patients of different illnesses. And it's just a creative brainstorming exercise, right? Not just one father or one mother, a group of mothers. And how can I then explore that? There's a lot of power that comes from thinking in groups. And I want to end with this story I think is super interesting. Is there was a documentarian who approached me, and he was doing a documentary of a kid that lived in one of the worst ghettos in Chicago, and he wanted to do a documentary about this kid's endeavor to get out of the ghetto, right? And he wanted to film this documentary of this kid, and he came to me and says, Houston, I'm not sure what to do because I can't find financing for my documentary, and how do I use Transmedia to increase that offering? I said, well, you need to figure out what your story world is. What's your story world? He said, well, it's the kid. I said, no, it's not. The kid is the character, right? And the kid is the story. But what's the story world? And it's this housing unit in Chicago. It's the ghetto itself, right? And I said, okay, so who are the other people that live in that housing unit? And how can we tell their stories? And he came up with a story. He came up with one guy that lives there. Did some research. There was an old, I think it was a Korean War veteran that was there, a Purple Heart recipient that had all these amazing war stories. There were 2 twins that stood outside, these 2 little girls that were like 13 years old. They were identical twins that they rapped on the street corner, and they were really super talented musicians and rappers. There was this old lady who would cook for a lot of people in the building and spend her whole day cooking and delivering food. And whenever she would deliver food, she would deliver the food and she would tell them a dirty joke and like make a grown man blush type of a dirty joke, right? And that was just her thing. And he was going over, so that, these are all these other people, actual people that live in this actual place. And I said, great, tell all their stories, right? Turn it into a brand, not just a product. And so all of a sudden we sketched out, some ideas, and he decided to actually help the girls produce an album, the rappers produce their album. He took all the guys, the war veterans, war stories, and he published them in a self-published novel that's sort of an anthology of these war stories. He came up with a cookbook for the old lady where he took all her recipes, and on one side of the cookbook he had the recipe, on the other side it had a dirty joke, right, that went with the recipe. And then there was also the documentary, and then he created synergy between them all. So in the documentary he made sure he showed all of these characters. Then in the cookbook there was references to the girls, and in the girls' songs they were referencing the war veteran that lived down the hall from them, right? And so all of a sudden he identified that story world, identified not just one person that lives in the ghetto, but multiple people that do. He went and looked at it as a group rather than just the individual, and all of a sudden that one documentary became a brand with synergy, a branded ecosystem, and he was able to now take that to an investor who saw multiple ways to be able to generate revenue into the brand and get a return on the investment, multiple ways to build a broader awareness for the documentary, and ultimately more stories that sort of give visibility to the plight of these people living in those conditions. And so that, I think, is the interesting opportunity when it comes to developing Storyworld. And that principle is the same principle that is being used in the MCU, that's being used in Star Wars, Harry Potter, Dune, all these things that we're seeing hit the market. It's all the exact same principle, just extracted and contextualized to smaller market content. So when you want a good story world, think about a story world that can support multiple stories. How many stories can you get out of there? Multiple mediums. Can it be movies and books and podcasts and board games? And the more the better, right? Multiple genres. Can you have a story world that has a horror story and a romance story and an action adventure story and a mystery, and the more genres the better, and obviously multiple characters. The more characters you can follow, the better as well. So that's my time here. You can follow me on Twitter, Houston_Howard. You go to superstory.works. And I also have a podcast that you can check out. It's called the Superstory Podcast, that I think would be helpful for you guys as we move on to this conversation of story worlds. So that's all I got. Chris, I don't know how much time we have left. Do we have time for any questions?
We are fully out of time. Okay. But if you're up for it, Houston, we'd love to have you back for a special Zoom conversation at any time, because I know you got a baby. So between now and the end of time, we'll make it happen.
Let's do it. Let's do it. All right.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So let's give a virtual round of applause for Houston for speaking at 2,000 miles an hour and enlightening us and expanding our mind universe. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you don't freeze to death over there in Texas. And I look forward to that Zoom as soon as we can.
Perfect. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Houston.